There's a kind of land that nobody wants, not because it's worthless, but because it remembers too much. Blackwater Flats had been sitting on the county's delinquent tax rolls for 11 years when Mabel Dunn drove out to look at it in the back of a borrowed truck, wearing her dead husband's boots and carrying a folded piece of paper with a hand-drawn map on it. The county assessor had laughed when she called. Not cruelly, just the way a man laughs when he thinks he's about to save someone from themselves. "Ma'am, it's a swamp," he'd said. 62 acres of standing water, cypress root, and moccasin nests. We've had 3 buyers in 8 years, all 3 walked. "I'll give you $1, she said. He'd paused for all of it. For all of it. She signed the papers on a Tuesday. By Thursday, she had her first 6 hogs on the property. By the following spring, those hogs had begun pulling things out of the ground that had no business being there. What followed was not the story of a woman who bought cheap land and got lucky. It was something older than luck and considerably less comfortable. It was the story of what happens when the past refuses to stay buried and what a person owes the dead when they're the only living soul standing over them. I know because I was there for most of it. I kept a log. I always keep a log. What follows is what I wrote down and what I couldn't bring myself to throw away. The first time I saw Mabel Dunn, she was waist-deep in a flooded drainage ditch, arguing with a cypress tree. Not arguing in the way a person argues with furniture they've stubbed their toe on. I mean a sustained, methodical disagreement, the kind where you can tell both parties have been at it for a while and neither one plans to concede. She had both hands braced against the bark, her boots sunk in the black mud somewhere below the water line, and she was pushing. The tree did not move. She pushed again. I sat on the fence line of what was technically still county easement land and watched, because I had been on my way somewhere else entirely, and there is something about a woman arguing with a cypress tree that stops a man in his tracks. "Ma'am," I called. She didn't look up. "I can see you sitting there, Mr. Holt. Calvin Holt." I pulled off my hat on reflex, which was stupid since she still wasn't looking at me. "I ranch the Palmer land over the ridge." "I know who ranches the Palmer land." She stopped pushing and stood back, hands on her knees, breathing. "You going to sit there, or are you going to help me move this root?" It was not a root, it was a tree, but I climbed off the fence anyway. Her name, I learned in the first 2 minutes of knowing her, was Mabel Agnes Dunn, née Coltrane, widow of Leonard Dunn, who had died of a stroke 3 winters prior while checking on a water heater, which she described as a perfectly undignified way to go, though he would have hated a fuss. She was 57 years old. She had moved from Odessa after selling Leonard's welding shop, a decision her 2 adult children had described as impulsive, and which she described as long overdue. She had no farming experience, no livestock experience beyond a single goat she'd kept in her 20s that she called a personality experiment, and she had just paid $1 for 62 acres of Blackwater swamp in the eastern flats of Crockett County, Texas. Why, I asked, because there wasn't a more tactful way to put it. She pulled her boot out of the mud with a sound like a cork leaving a bottle. Because it was the only land left in the county, I could afford that nobody else was fighting over. Nobody was fighting over it because it floods 4 months of the year, and everything that lives in it either stings or bites. That's what they said about Leonard when I married him. She looked at the tree, then at me, then at the tree again. "Help me shift this root left about 2 feet so I can get a drainage channel started." I helped her shift the root. I'm still not entirely sure why. That was the 3rd week of October. By the time I'd finished fall gathering on my own place and had a moment to breathe, Mabel had fenced off the driest corner of the Blackwater acreage, about 8 acres in the northeastern quadrant, where a shallow limestone shelf kept the ground from turning entirely to soup, and had moved in 6 Duroc Cross hogs from a sale barn in San Angelo. I drove out to see them on a Saturday morning, mostly out of rancher's curiosity and partly because my neighbor Rosa, who ran the gas station 2 miles east, had told me that Mabel's pickup had been seen at the property every day at 5:30 a.m., and that Rosa was beginning to find it personally embarrassing how hard the woman worked. The hogs were large, reddish-brown, and occupied. That's the only word for it. They moved through the fenced area with a focused, purposeful energy, rooting up the soft ground in long furrows, turning soil that hadn't been turned in longer than any of us could guess. Mabel stood at the fence watching them with an expression I'd come to recognize as her default mode. Analytical, slightly amused, a little tired. "They're working," I said. "That's the plan." She poured coffee from a thermos without offering me any, which I also came to recognize as her default mode. Hogs are the cheapest earth movers in Texas. Leonard used to say that. He was right about two things in his whole life, and that was one of them. What was the other? Me, she said it without a trace of sentimentality, the way you'd state a fact about weather. I leaned against the fence post. The hogs moved. The water table was low enough this time of year that the ground in the fenced area was merely damp rather than flooded, a narrow seasonal window that Mabel had apparently calculated with precision. She'd done her homework. Whatever I'd thought about her on the day we met, I was already revising it. "You're not planning to just raise hogs," I said. It wasn't really a question. She glanced at me sideways. "Took you long enough. Drainage first, then clearing, then what crops?" "Eventually, first I want to know what's under there." I looked at her, under the swamp. The county records go back to 1901. Before that, there's nothing. No surveys, no deeds, no land grants I can find. She closed the thermos. A 62-acre parcel of land in central Texas with no recorded ownership history before 1901. Does that not strike you as strange? It did now that she said it. Most land in this part of Texas had been parceled, surveyed, contested, litigated, stolen, resold, and surveyed again going back to the Republic. Gaps in the record weren't unheard of, but a gap that size, that clean, was unusual. Maybe it was just always considered wetlands, I said, never worth surveying. Maybe, she didn't sound convinced. Or maybe somebody made sure it stayed off the books. I wrote that down in my log that night, not because I thought it was significant, but because something in her voice when she said it made the back of my neck prickle. I have a policy. When the back of my neck prickles, I write it down. November came in hard, with a cold front that pushed down from the panhandle and turned the Blackwater Flats into a glittering sheet of shallow, standing water. Mabel's hogs retreated to the high ground she'd built them, a raised sleeping platform on the limestone shelf, and waited with the philosophical patience that large animals develop when they understand they cannot outrun the weather. Mabel, during those flooded weeks, drove out every day anyway. She waded the perimeter in chest waders. She took measurements. She came back covered in mud and smelling like sulfur and cypress, and something older and darker underneath, a smell like overturned centuries, and she wrote things in a green composition notebook that she kept tucked inside her rain jacket. I know this because Rosa told me, and because I drove past twice and saw her truck in the pre-dawn dark, and because once I stopped and found her standing at the edge of the fenced area with a flashlight and a long wooden probe, pushing it down into the mud in a methodical grid pattern. "What are you looking for?" I asked. She pulled the probe up. The mud released it with a reluctant suck. Hard spots, variations in depth, places where the substrate changes. She moved 3 feet to the left and pushed the probe down again. "There's something under the northwest corner, about 4 feet down. It runs in a line." "Aligned? Like a wall, Calvin?" She said my name for the first time like she'd always used it. "Like a foundation wall." I stood there in the dark in November with the cold water reflecting the flashlight beam and the cypress trees throwing long shadows and the hogs shifting and grunting somewhere behind the fence, and I felt the back of my neck prickle again. I wrote it down when I got home. I wrote, she said, like a foundation wall. She didn't sound surprised. She found the first thing in the second week of December, when the water receded enough for the hogs to work the northwest corner. She called me. I had by then given her my number, on the grounds that someone with that much ambition and that little backup probably needed a neighbor they could call at 6:40 in the morning. Her voice was controlled in a way that told me control was costing her something. "You should come see this," she said. I went. The hog named Prospero, she had named them all, which she did in the same practical, unapologetic way she did everything, had worked a patch of ground just inside the northwest fence corner down to about 18 inches. The soil there was darker than the surrounding area, blacker, and at the bottom of the depression Prospero had made, I could see the edge of something, not stone exactly. Something that had once been wood, compressed over decades into something denser and stranger, A dark, fibrous mass that held its shape the way wood does when it's been underwater long enough to petrify. It was a plank, a shaped, cut plank of timber, not driftwood, not a root. A plank that someone had milled and placed deliberately into the ground. Mabel was crouching over it, her green notebook open on her knee. She had already sketched the position. She had already measured its angle relative to the fence line and to the compass bearing she'd established using her phone. She had done all this before calling me. "How long?" I asked, meaning how long had it been there? She ran her finger along the edge without touching it. "I called the extension office at A&M last night. Told them I had a timber sample from a subsurface context. The man I spoke to said that depending on the wood species and the preservation conditions," she paused, "submersion in low-oxygen blackwater can preserve wood for anywhere from 100 to several hundred years." I looked at the plank, I looked at her. "Several hundred. That's the upper range," she closed the notebook. "But Calvin, look at the cut." I looked, even compressed and darkened as it was, even after God knows how many seasons underwater, the edge of that plank showed the marks of a saw. Not an axe saw, not a broad axe, a saw with regular, close-set teeth. The kind of cut that meant a working mill. The kind of cut that meant somebody had a mill, and timber, and enough reason to build something in the middle of a Texas swamp. "Who had a sawmill in Crockett County before 1901? I asked. She looked at me with something that was not quite triumph and not quite grief, something in between. "That," she said, "is the right question. I should explain something about myself here, because it's relevant. I keep a log. I have kept a log every day since I was 19 years old when my father handed me a composition notebook and told me that a man who doesn't write things down is a man who doesn't know where he came from. He was talking about ranch records, breeding dates, rainfall, calf weights, but I extended the principle. I log everything. Weather, conversations, things I see on the fence line, things that wake me up at 3 in the morning. I have 41 notebooks in a wooden box under my bed. My ex-wife thought it was strange. My kids think it's charming in a slightly alarming way. I think it's the only thing that keeps me honest about my own life, because memory is a liar and a flatterer and a coward, and paper is none of those things. I tell you this because what happened at Blackwater Flats over the following months is something I need you to understand I recorded in real time. I'm not reconstructing it from memory. I'm not softening the edges or straightening the narrative into something tidier than it was. What I'm giving you is what I wrote down, what I saw with my eyes, and what it cost us both to understand. Mabel spent the week after finding the plank at the county courthouse, the state archive in Austin, and 2 university libraries whose names I did not write down. She came back with photocopied documents and a look on her face that I recognized from the way certain livestock look when they've come across something on the range that doesn't fit any category they have for the world. Unsettled, focused, unwilling to look away. She spread the documents on my kitchen table because her single-wide trailer, which she'd placed on the limestone shelf of the property as her temporary residence, had a table the size of a dinner plate. I made coffee. She organized papers. The records, she explained, showed that Blackwater Flats had first appeared on county tax assessments in 1901, listed as uncultivable wetlands, no assessed value held in county remainder. Prior to that, nothing. But adjacent parcels, the land to the north, the land to the east, had survey records going back to the 1870s and 1880s. Homestead claims, Republic of Texas land grants, the normal paperwork of a settled territory. The gap is deliberate, she said. She put her finger on a spot on the photocopied map. Every surrounding parcel has documentation. This one doesn't. Somebody left it out. Left it out or lost the records. Records don't disappear from every jurisdiction simultaneously. She moved her finger. The county, the state land office, the general land office archive, all of them. The parcel just isn't there before 1901. I poured the coffee and sat down across from her. What do you think that means? She looked up at me. She had dark circles under her eyes that she hadn't had 2 weeks ago. I think it means somebody made it not be there, she said. And I think the reason they made it not be there is standing at the bottom of that swamp. December deepened. The water receded further in the northwest corner as Mabel ran her hand-dug drainage channel another 12 feet east, redirecting the seep from a cracked limestone fault line. Prospero and a hog named, Ruth then worked the newly exposed ground with characteristic hog indifference to anything except the next interesting smell. Ruth Ann found the second thing on December 19th. I remember because I wrote the date down. It was ceramic, or what had been ceramic, a curved fragment of fired clay, dark red with a black interior, preserving on its exterior surface the ghost of a pattern. Not a random pattern, a deliberate one, geometric, repeating. Mabel held it in both hands for a long time without speaking. The hogs moved around her feet. The morning light was thin and silver-cold. I stood back because something about the way she was holding it told me this was not a moment that wanted company. Then she set it down very carefully in the foam-lined box she'd started keeping in her truck bed. Apache, she said, or a related tradition. The geometric work is consistent with Southern Plains pottery from the pre-reservation period. She paused, before the removals. I didn't say anything. There was nothing useful to say. She picked up her notebook and wrote something down. Then she looked at the plank, still visible at the edge of the excavation, and at the ceramic fragment in the box, and I watched her face move through something I didn't have the vocabulary for then. I've thought about it since. It was the expression of a person who has asked a question and received an answer they didn't entirely want. Somebody built something here, she said, not to me, to the ground maybe, to the swamp. And somebody's things are in it, and somebody made sure nobody would go looking. She straightened. She rolled her shoulders back with a deliberateness that reminded me of a person picking up something very heavy. Get the probe, she said. We need to map this whole corner. We found 4 more plank ends and 2 additional ceramic fragments before the year turned. Mabel logged everything, position, depth, orientation, the compass bearing of each piece relative to the others. She was building a map. Not of what was there now, but of what had been there once, before the water came, before the silence, before 11 years of county tax delinquency, and whatever decades of deliberate forgetting preceded that. On New Year's Eve, we sat on the limestone shelf beside her trailer and watched the county fireworks from San Angelo, which were visible as a faint shimmer on the southern horizon, and she told me about Leonard. She didn't tell it like a love story, and she didn't tell it like a tragedy. She told it the way people tell things they've been carrying long enough that they've worn a groove in their hands, something they know the shape of completely. Leonard had been a good man with a quick temper and a slow apology, a man who built beautiful things with metal and couldn't always say the right thing but could always do the right thing when it mattered. He'd had a stroke at 61 on a Tuesday afternoon checking a water heater and had been gone before the ambulance arrived. She'd been in the next room. She'd heard him fall. She said it calmly. She looked at the horizon while she said it. He used to say the worst thing about regret is that it knows your address, she said. He meant about arguments, about things he'd said wrong. She turned the coffee cup in her hands. I think about that a lot standing over that ground, about things that have found their address and won't leave. I didn't write down what I said in response. I don't think I said anything worth recording. What I wrote was, she's not here for the land. She's here because she recognized something in it. She recognized a thing that had been made invisible on purpose. She knows what that feels like. I have read that sentence many times since. I still think it's right. The new year came. The hogs worked. The ground gave up its pieces slowly, in the way that things buried deep and long give themselves up, reluctantly, and in the wrong order, so that you understand the shape of the thing only after you've already felt it. By the end of January, Mabel's map covered 2 full notebook pages. Foundation lines, ceramic scatter pattern, 3 what she was now calling post molds, dark stains in the soil where wooden posts had rotted centuries ago but left their shadows in the changed chemistry of the ground. It was a structure, not large, perhaps 20 feet by 30, rectangular, oriented slightly off the cardinal points in a way that corresponded to no surveying convention Mabel could identify. But that aligned, when she overlaid her map on a topo sheet, with a seasonal creek channel that no longer existed. Somebody built here, she said, because the water was right, because the creek ran through, because it was a good place. And then, she looked at her map, and then somebody made it a bad place. She tapped the paper with her pen. And then the water came back and covered it, and somebody made sure nobody came to look. But they kept working. That's the thing about pigs that most people don't account for. The cold slows them down, but it doesn't stop them. They're problem solvers by nature, and the problem of interesting soil never stops being interesting to a pig, regardless of temperature. Prospero, in particular, had developed what Mabel described as a professional relationship with the northwest corner of the property. He returned to it every morning with the regularity of a man clocking in for a shift, and he worked it with a focused, methodical patience that felt, in a way I'm not entirely comfortable admitting, almost deliberate. It was Prospero who found the beads. Not all at once. Pigs don't work that way, and neither does buried ground. The first one came up on a Tuesday, barely visible, a disk of blue-green glass, smaller than my thumbnail, half compressed by the weight of the saturated soil above it. Mabel almost missed it. She almost didn't crouch down when Prospero paused and pushed his snout against the dirt a second time in the same spot, with more insistence than usual. She almost didn't run her fingers through the turned soil. But she did. She had been paying attention to what the Hogs told her for 4 months by then, and she had learned the difference between the working snuffle and the something here pause. She crouched. She felt through the cold mud with careful, unhurried fingers. Then she went still. She found 7 that day. 7 beads, strung together once on something that had not survived, laid out across approximately 14 inches of subsurface ground in a slight arc that might have been a curve in a necklace or a scatter from breakage. She could not tell which, not yet. She photographed them in place before she moved a single one. She sketched their positions in the notebook. She measured their depth, their mutual spacing, their orientation relative to the foundation lines she'd already mapped. Then she placed them, one by one, in a small glass jar she'd carried in her jacket pocket for 2 weeks in anticipation of exactly this kind of moment. She had thought ahead. She had been thinking ahead since October. I was not there when she found them. She texted me a photograph, her open palm with the 7 beads arranged on it, blue-green and clouded and impossibly small, and a single line, coming to make sense of this. Have coffee ready. I made coffee. I got out the big table map she'd transferred from her notebook pages. I waited. She was there in 40 minutes, still wearing the field jacket with the mud on the left sleeve from where she'd braced herself over Prospero's excavation. She sat down, put the jar on the table, and looked at the beads for a moment before opening her notebook. Trade beads, she said. European manufacture almost certainly. The blue-green coloration, the shape, the size, they're consistent with glass trade beads distributed through the southern plains from the late 1700s into the mid-1800s. She opened the notebook to a page where she'd already sketched reference samples she'd pulled from an academic article. Probably Spanish colonial distribution, given the geography. Could also be French, but the color pattern skews Spanish. I looked at the beads and then at her reference sketches. The similarity was unmistakable. So the people who lived in this structure were trading with Spanish colonials. Or receiving or taking, she said it without editorializing. Trade goods moved in a lot of directions, not all of them voluntary. I wrote that down, not all of them voluntary. What does it mean that they're here, I asked, together in that position? She was quiet for a moment. Outside, the February wind pushed at the trailer walls. They were worn, she said, or carried. They weren't trade stock in a container, they were personal. And the position, the arc. She traced her finger over her sketch without touching the paper. Whoever had these, they were wearing them when the structure was built, or when it ended. I let that sit. I didn't push it into a sentence out loud, because some things need to find their own shape before you put words around them. She poured coffee she hadn't asked for and wrapped both hands around the mug and said, I need to call somebody who knows what they're doing. The name she came back with, after 2 days of phone calls and 1 trip to Austin, was Dr. Rosario Quintana-Wells, an archaeologist at UT who had spent 15 years working on sites connected to 18th and 19th century Apache and Comanche territorial ranges in the Trans-Pecos and Southern Plains. Mabel had found her through a contact at the Texas Historical Commission, who had responded to Mabel's preliminary description of the site with what Mabel described as the fastest callback I have ever received from a government office. Dr. Quintana-Wells drove out on a Thursday in a white university truck loaded with equipment cases and accompanied by 2 graduate students whose names I've changed here because they didn't ask to be in anyone's story. She was a compact woman in her mid-50s with close-cut gray hair and the unhurried movements of someone who has spent years crouching at the level of the earth. She looked at Mabel's map for a long time without speaking. She looked at the beads. She looked at the ceramic fragments Mabel had transferred to labeled containers. Then she walked the northwest corner of the property with her hands in her jacket pockets and her eyes on the ground, moving slowly, stopping frequently, occasionally crouching and rising without explanation. When she came back to where Mabel and I were standing, she said, "Where did you get your probe data?" Mabel explained. The doctor nodded. "Your foundation readings are consistent with what I'd expect from an early colonial era or pre-colonial structure in this substrate. The wood preservation in Blackwater like this can be extraordinary. We've found material in East Texas bog contexts that's dated to 1300 years. In a system like this one, with the low oxygen and the tannic acids from the cypress, you could be looking at material from anywhere between the 1600s and the early 1800s. She paused. The ceramics and the beads are more specific. Those put you in a narrower window, probably mid-1700s to early 1800s. Mabel nodded like she'd already calculated this. And the structure itself, what it looks like. Dr. Quintana Wells looked toward the northwest corner. The orientation, the post pattern you've mapped, the location relative to the old creek channel. She was quiet for a moment. This looks like habitation, extended intentional habitation, not a seasonal camp. People who built here planned to stay. And then they didn't, Mabel said. The doctor looked at her. No, then they didn't. What followed was not an excavation in the formal sense. The site was not yet officially registered. The property was private, and Dr. Quintana Wells was present in an advisory capacity rather than a professional one, with all the complications that entailed. What it was a careful, methodical, intensely focused 3-day survey of the northwest corner during a window when the water table was low enough to allow surface access. The graduate students documented everything. I stood at the perimeter and watched and took notes in my log because I did not know what else to do and because Mabel asked me to stay. "You've been here from the beginning," she said. "You should see the whole thing." I have thought about those 3 days many times. I've thought about what it feels like to stand at the edge of something that has been hidden for so long that its hiding is more real than whatever it was before the hiding started. The ground doesn't give things up dramatically. That's a movie version, a television version. In reality, what it does is accumulate. One fragment, one post-mold, one bead. One animal bone with cut marks that Quintana Wells identified as intentional butchering in a domestic context. One piece of carved wood that was not architectural, that had a shape that suggested it was made to be held. They pieced it together slowly, patiently, with a care that felt, to me watching, like the only appropriate response to what the ground was giving them. By the end of the 3rd day, they had the outline of something that Quintana Wells described in terms careful enough to be scientific and human enough to be felt. A structure, occupied over multiple seasons based on the layering. A household, the word she used deliberately. Not a camp, not an encampment. A household in the full sense, people who cooked and slept and kept things and wore things and came home to this place. Apache, most likely, based on the ceramic tradition and the geographic and temporal context, though she flagged the possibility of cultural mixing. There had been Jumano and Tonkawa and Spanish-influenced Apache communities across this region whose material cultures overlapped in complicated ways by the early colonial period. "It's a specific family group most likely," she said on the 3rd evening, standing with the last light going orange behind the cypress trees. "Or an extended family, maybe a small band. Based on the size of the structure and the material density, I'd estimate you're looking at somewhere between 6 and 15 people." "Living here," Mabel said. "Living here." And then, the doctor didn't answer immediately. The cypress trees threw long shadows. Somewhere in the fenced area, Prospero moved through the dark. "The site shows signs of abrupt abandonment," Quintana Wells said finally. "Not gradual. The material isn't cleared out in the way it would be if people left voluntarily and had time to pack. Things are where people were using them. The beads were worn. The bone scatter is mid-meal, not butchery waste." She paused. "People don't leave their beads and their dinner." Mabel was looking at the ground. She had her arms crossed over her chest in the cold, and her jaw was set in the particular way I'd seen it set when she was holding something in that didn't want to be held in. "Something came," she said. It was not a question. "Something came," the doctor said. "That night I drove home and sat at my kitchen table for a long time before I opened my log. I've written a lot of things in 41 notebooks. I've written about cattle prices and drought years and the death of my father and the end of my marriage and the birth of my grandchildren and the specific quality of light on certain mornings over the Palmer Ridge that I never want to forget. I've written things that make me proud and things that make me ashamed and things that are just data. Rainfall, weights, dates. What I wrote that night, I'll put here exactly as I wrote it. The ground at Blackwater kept them. The water and the acid and the dark kept them when nothing else would. 6 to 15 people. They had a household. They had beads and pottery and cut meat, and a carved piece of wood someone made to be held. And then something came and they left those things, and I do not think they left voluntarily, because people who leave voluntarily take their beads. Mabel bought this land for $1 because nobody wanted it. Nobody wanted it because it was a swamp. It was a swamp because the creek channel broke in the mid-1800s. I looked this up tonight, and yes, there's a geological record of a channel shift east of here, dated approximately 1830 to 1850, and the water spread and the ground went soft and everything under it went dark. And before that, somebody made sure there were no records, no surveys, no deeds, no documented existence. I am a man who keeps records because my father told me records are how you know where you came from. Somebody made sure this place had no records, and I keep thinking about what that means, about who decides which things get written down and which things get buried. Mabel knows. I think she's known since she drove out here in borrowed boots in October. I think she bought this land for $1 because something in her recognized something in it. And I think the Hogs finding things is not actually the thing. The Hogs are just the mechanism. The thing is that she came looking. I put my pen down. I sat there until past midnight. Then I got up and drove back to Blackwater Flats and knocked on the trailer door, and when Mabel answered it, I said, "I think you need to call the Texas Historical Commission, the real call, the formal one." She looked at me for a moment. Her eyes were very clear and very tired. "I've been sitting here trying to decide," she said. "I know. It means losing control of the site. It means people, bureaucracy, timelines I can't manage. I know. It means it becomes something official, something that can't be undone. I know." She was quiet for a long moment. "They deserve that," she said. "Whoever they were, they deserve to be on the record." She stepped back from the door to let me in. I came inside. She picked up her phone and began to find the number. Outside, the February wind pushed at the walls. Inside, the glass jar of beads sat on the table between us, catching the trailer light in 7 small blue-green points, like something that had been waiting a very long time to be seen. The process that followed the formal call was, as Mabel had predicted, a complicated, slow-moving, and often frustrating institutional machinery that required her patience and occasionally her stubbornness. Forms, jurisdictional questions, a required consultation with tribal historic preservation offices, halts to any non-supervised ground disturbance, which meant the Hogs had to be moved to the eastern acreage while the northwest corner was formally assessed. She moved them without complaint. She moved them, and then she went back to managing the institutional process with the same practical, unhurried focus she'd brought to everything else. But I watched her during those weeks, and I noticed something. She was not the same woman who had been arguing with a cypress tree in October. This one was still practical, still direct, still capable of silencing a room with a flat look. But there was something additional in her now, something that I can only describe as weight, in the way that some weight is not a burden but a ballast. She moved through the world like a person who was carrying something real and had decided that the carrying was not optional. One afternoon in late February, when the THC team was working the northwest corner under proper archaeological protocols and Mabel and I were standing at the fence perimeter watching, she said something I've thought about almost every day since. "Leonard would have understood this," she said. "I waited. He built things," she said. "He built things with his hands, and he understood that a thing made with hands means something, that the work of hands has value beyond what it produces." She paused. "Somebody made a household here. They built a structure. They made pottery. They wore things that were beautiful. They cooked their food and kept their things and came home." She looked at the ground where the archaeologists were working. "And then somebody made sure nobody would know that household had existed." She turned to look at me. "That's the thing I can't put down," she said. "Not the history lesson, not the artifacts. The decision somebody made to erase them, to make them not be there on any record so that when we came along, there'd be nothing to look for. I thought about my log, about the 41 notebooks, about my father handing me the first one. They almost succeeded, I said. Almost, she said, but the ground kept them, the water kept them, and the cypress kept them, and the dark kept them. She turned back to the fence. I just showed up with Hogs. The THC team's preliminary assessment came back in the first week of March. I will not reproduce it in full. It was a formal document, dense with terminology and careful institutional hedging. But the substance was clear enough. Significant archaeological site. Habitation evidence consistent with Southern Apache cultural tradition. Radiocarbon analysis pending on the wood samples, but preliminary assessment suggested occupation between approximately 1730 and 1840. Evidence of abrupt abandonment. No evidence of prior documentation. Recommendation: full site designation and formal excavation protocol. Consultation with relevant tribal historic preservation offices to be ongoing and primary to any further work. Mabel read the document 3 times, sitting at her small table. Then she put it down and looked out the trailer window at the cypress trees in the winter light. 1930, she said, meaning 1730. They were here for over 100 years, maybe, generations. Generations, I agreed. And then 30 years after they were gone, somebody took them off the map. She was quiet. Somebody who was here, who knew they'd been here, and decided that their having been here was information that needed to disappear. She picked up the jar of beads from where it always sat on the table now, between conversations and documents and coffee cups, and turned it in her hands. I'm not a historian, she said. I'm not an archaeologist. I'm a widow from Odessa who bought a swamp for $1. She set the jar down. But those things don't stop being real because someone erased the record. They were here. Prospero found their beads. Outside from the eastern acreage where the Hogs had been relocated, I could hear Prospero moving. Methodical, purposeful, working the ground. What are you going to do? I asked. She didn't answer immediately. She picked up her pen and opened her green notebook, and she wrote something down with the deliberateness of a person making a commitment. Then she looked up. The same thing I've been doing, she said. Keep showing up, keep looking, keep writing things down. I thought about that all the way home. I thought about it while I fed cattle in the dark, and while I sat at my kitchen table with my own notebook open, and while the February wind finally turned, just slightly, just a fraction of a degree, toward something warmer. I wrote, she said, keep writing things down. She said it like it was obvious, like it was the only answer to everything. I think she might be right. Spring came to Blackwater Flats the way it always comes to this part of Texas. Not gradually, not gently, but suddenly and with force, as if the land had been holding its breath all winter and finally let go. The water table dropped. The cypress trees put out new growth, that particular acid yellow-green that exists nowhere else in the color spectrum. The birds returned, herons first, then the smaller things, the warblers and the swallows moving through on their long routes north, stopping over in the wetland margins that Mabel had by this point decided she would not drain. Not fully. The drainage channel she'd hand-dug in November redirected the worst of the seasonal flooding, but she'd left the southwestern corner deliberately wet, a decision that had surprised me in October but made sense to me now in March. It's their ground, she'd said when I asked. I'm not going to dry it out just because I can. The Hogs were back in the northern acreage by the first week of March, relocated there while the formal archaeological work proceeded on the northwest corner. Mabel had acquired 4 more animals over the winter, a practical decision about productivity and income from the eventual herd. And the new additions were large and young and aggressive about the ground in the way that new animals always are, before they settle into the particular personality a place gives them. She'd named them, of course. She always named them. I was out on a Tuesday morning in the second week of March when she found the next thing. The last thing, in a sense, though that's not entirely accurate. What she found that morning was not the last thing the ground held, but it was the thing that held the most. The one that changed the temperature of everything that came after. She found it herself, without the Hogs, without me, without the archaeologists who had finished their primary survey and were working through the permitting and reporting process before the next phase could begin. She found it because she was walking the western fence line in the early light, as she did every morning, and she looked down at the right moment. A corner of something had emerged from the soil at the base of the fence post. Not new. She told me later she thought it had been emerging for weeks, slowly, as the ground dried and contracted and released its grip fraction by fraction. But she had not seen it until that morning in the low angle of the early March sun, when the shadow it cast was longer than the object itself. She crouched. She cleared the soil around it with her hands, working carefully. She had learned how to do this. She had been watching the archaeologists for 6 weeks, and she had the instinct of someone who was born paying attention. It was a knife handle, or the remnant of one. The blade was gone. Iron doesn't survive in Blackwater the way wood and ceramic do. It oxidizes and loses itself to the ground over the long years. But the handle was bone, or what bone becomes after 2 centuries in tannic water. Dense, dark, almost mineral in feel and carved. She could see that it was carved. She could see the incised lines of a pattern. She did not move it. She covered it back with her hands, gently, and stood up and called me. I was there in 20 minutes. She was standing at the fence post with her arms crossed and her green notebook already out, and she had already sketched the position and depth. She uncovered it again for me to see. I crouched beside her. The handle lay in the exposed soil, dark and dense and patient. The carved pattern on it was geometric, repeating triangular forms, and in the center of them what appeared to be a figure, not detailed, worn with age and handling, not just with burial. Someone had held this thing many times over many years before the ground took it. It was used, Mabel said. Look at the wear on the grip section, right there and there. That's hand wear. Whoever carried this carried it for a long time. I looked. She was right. The surface of the handle in the grip section was smoother than the carved faces, worn by the repeated press of a palm and fingers over years or decades. It wasn't just a tool, I said. No, she was quiet. Tools get worn like that when they're used. Personal things get worn like that when they're kept. This was kept. We crouched over it together in the morning light, and I thought about a person keeping a knife for so long that the handle wore smooth under their hand. I thought about what it means to carry something for years until it becomes an extension of yourself, until the weight of it is so familiar that its absence would feel wrong. I thought about Mabel's green notebook, worn smooth at the spine. You should call Quintanawells before you call the THC team, I said. She should see this in place. Mabel nodded, already reaching for her phone. Dr. Quintanawells arrived that afternoon. She brought one of her graduate students, a tall young woman named, I'll call her P. She was quietly brilliant and deserves her privacy, who photographed the knife handle in place from 17 different angles before anyone touched it. The doctor crouched for a long time without speaking. Then she took a small brush from her kit and cleared the remaining soil away from the handle with the care of someone who understood exactly what they were doing and why it mattered. This is worked bone, she said. The carving is consistent with Southern Apache decorative tradition from the 18th century. The geometric pattern here, she touched the air above the incised triangles, not the surface, is a sky pattern. Specific meaning varies across groups, but generally associated with protection. She paused. This handle was made for a knife that was important, not a tool knife, a knife with significance. A ceremonial knife? I asked. She tilted her head. Not necessarily. Ceremonial is a word we use when we don't know the specific purpose. This could have been a personal knife carried for spiritual protection. It could have been an elder's knife or a chief's. It could have been a healer's. She looked at it. It was important. The carving tells us that. The wear tells us that it was carried for a very long time. She sat back on her heels. It's not in the excavation area, she said to Mabel. This is outside the surveyed zone. I know, Mabel said. That means the occupation may have extended farther west than our current mapping. I know that too. The doctor looked at her. This site may be significantly larger than the initial assessment. Mabel was looking at the knife handle. I know, she said for the 3rd time. I've been walking that fence line every morning for 5 months. The ground feels different in the western section. Softer, more turned. She paused. I think the hogs were in there for 6 weeks before we restricted access. I think they may have worked some of it already, and whatever was near the surface, whatever was most fragile, may already be disturbed. The silence that followed had a quality I can only describe as grief. Not dramatic grief, not keening, not collapse. The quiet, low-burning kind. The kind that sits in the chest. "We'll need to update the assessment," Quintana Wells said finally. "Expand the survey boundaries. It'll take time." "Take the time," Mabel said. She told me that evening about her daughter. I had not known she had a difficult relationship with her daughter. I had known she had 2 adult children who lived out of state, that she spoke of them with a careful neutrality that told me something, but I had not pushed. You don't push with Mabel. You wait. We were sitting outside the trailer in the last of the March light, the kind of evening where the sky goes through 4 colors in 20 minutes and you feel slightly privileged to be there for it. She'd made tea instead of coffee, which felt like a small concession to something. Her daughter's name was Nora. Nora had been very close to Leonard, closer than Mabel in the specific way that sometimes happens between fathers and daughters, a closeness that is real and whole, and that leaves a different kind of gap when it's gone. After Leonard's stroke, Nora had wanted Mabel to stay in Odessa, to stay in the house, to keep the familiar shapes of everything as they'd been. When Mabel sold the shop and bought the swamp for $1, Nora had stopped calling for 2 months. "She thinks I'm running away," Mabel said. "Are you?" She turned the tea mug in her hands. "I thought about that for a long time, whether I was coming here to disappear into something because the familiar shapes were too much." She paused. "But I think no. I think I came here because the land was invisible and I knew what that felt like, and I thought maybe if I showed up it would matter." "And does it?" She looked out at the western fence line, where the knife handle was now secured in the foam-lined case, carefully documented, waiting for the next phase of the process. "I don't know if it matters to them," she said. "To whoever they were, I don't know what the dead know or don't know or want from the living. I'm not sure anybody does." She sipped the tea. "But it matters to me. And it's going to matter to the record. And Quintana Wells's students are going to write this up, and it's going to be in the literature, and the tribal historic preservation offices are going to have it, and it won't be gone anymore." She looked at me. "That's enough," she said. "That's what I came here to do, make it not gone anymore." The formal expanded survey took most of April and part of May. I won't narrate it day by day, because most of archaeology is patience and methodology and careful documentation, and not the dramatic revelation of movies. It is, in some ways, the most honest thing I've ever witnessed, because it refuses to let the narrative move faster than the evidence warrants. What they found, carefully and methodically, and over the course of weeks, was this. The site was larger than the initial assessment. Substantially. The habitation evidence extended across approximately 38 of the 62 acres, concentrated in 2 clusters connected by a corridor of higher ground that followed the old creek channel before it shifted. The northwest cluster, Mabel's original discovery, was the older of the 2. The western cluster, the one outside the initial survey zone, the one the Hogs had partially disturbed before the access restriction, showed evidence of a later occupation. Later meaning roughly 1800 to 1830 or 1840, the most recent layer, the last people there. The western cluster was where most of the personal items were concentrated. More ceramic fragments, more beads, 12 additional glass trade beads, 3 shell beads that Quintana Wells identified as potentially locally made. A stone abrading surface with organic residue that lab testing would later suggest was plant material consistent with medicine preparation. A concentration of animal bone that included species not native to the immediate area, which suggested a wide-ranging group with long supply lines or trade connections, or both. And one more thing, found in the last week of the Western Survey by P., the graduate student, in the soft, dark soil 2 feet down in what had been the interior of the second structure. A small clay figure, roughly formed, not refined, not ceremonial quality, but clearly intentional. A human shape, arms slightly out from the body, head tilted in a way that suggested attention or listening. It had been fired, which is why it survived. Someone had put it in a fire and hardened it to last. P called Quintana Wells over without speaking. They crouched over it together. Then Quintana Wells looked up at Mabel, who was standing at the edge of the excavation, and the look on the doctor's face was something I wrote down that night and have looked at many times since. She looked like a person standing in front of something that refused to be made into a category. Mabel came to the edge and looked into the excavation at the small clay figure. She stood there for a long time. "Someone made this," she said. Yes, Quintana Wells said. To last. Yes. Someone made something to last in a place where they knew, maybe, that they weren't going to last. The doctor didn't answer. Maybe there wasn't an answer. Maybe she'd run into this wall before, the place where the evidence stops and the silence starts, and you have to decide what to do with the silence. Mabel stood at the edge of the excavation, and I watched her face. She was not crying. She was not performing. She was looking at the small clay figure with the complete attention of someone who has decided that some things deserve to be seen. After a while, she said, "Don't cover it, not yet. Let me stand here a minute." Nobody covered it. We all stood there, the archaeologists and the graduate students and me with my notebook and Mabel with her arms crossed, and the spring light coming through the cypress trees at a low angle that made the shadows long and golden and strange. Nora came in May. I don't know exactly what prompted the visit. Mabel didn't tell me, and I didn't ask. She called me on a Wednesday to say her daughter was arriving Friday and could I be around Saturday morning, because there was something she wanted Nora to see and she thought an objective person might be useful. I understood this to mean she was afraid. Not of Nora, not exactly, but of what the visit would cost, of whether the thing she'd built here and the thing she'd found here would be legible to a person who'd needed her to stay where the familiar shapes were. Nora arrived on Friday afternoon in a rental car. She was taller than I'd expected, with Leonard's hands and Mabel's eyes and the bearing of someone who had been bracing for something for a while. She shook my hand formally when Mabel introduced us, looked around the property with an expression I couldn't quite read, and said very little. That evening I drove away and let them have it. Saturday morning I came back at 9. They were both standing at the perimeter of the expanded survey area, the western cluster, which Quintana Wells had left with minimal covering over the key features so they could be viewed. Mabel was talking, quietly, in the way she explained things. No excess, no drama, just the thing itself. Nora was listening with her arms crossed in a way that looked defensive, but wasn't. It was the posture of someone concentrating very hard. I recognized it because Mabel stood that way too. I stayed back and watched. At some point, Mabel led Nora to the small shelter Quintana Wells had set up over the area where the clay figure had been found, now properly covered and documented, but visible through the clear protective sheet. Nora crouched and looked at it for a long time. I could not hear what they said. I was too far away, and I think that was right. What I saw was, Nora reached out and put her hand on her mother's arm, and Mabel let her, and they stayed like that, crouched over the ground, looking at what someone had made to last. I wrote it down that night. I always write things down. The formal site designation came through in June. Texas State Archaeological Landmark designation, with an additional recommendation for Federal Register nomination. The tribal historic preservation consultations were ongoing, a process that Quintana Wells described as not fast, but right, and that Mabel accepted with the patience she brought to everything. The Hogs, by this point, had been permanently relocated to the eastern acreage, which Mabel was developing into a small but productive operation. She'd added 8 more animals. She'd signed a contract with a specialty butcher in San Antonio. She'd put in a rudimentary irrigation system and was trialing drought-adapted sorghum in the higher ground along the ridge. The land was producing. Not spectacularly, not yet. She was still a widow from Odessa who'd been a rancher for less than a year, but genuinely, sustainably, in the patient way that land produces when you pay attention to it. She moved out of the single-wide in June, and into a small, permanent structure she'd had built on the limestone shelf. Cinder block foundation, metal roof, a covered porch she'd furnished with 2 old chairs and a milk crate that served as a side table. It was not beautiful in any conventional sense. It was a thing built to be there, to last, to be lived in. I came for coffee on the first Tuesday of July, and we sat on the porch in the morning heat and watched the herons move across the far end of the western marsh. And she said something that I need to put down exactly, because I've been carrying it since. "I've been thinking about Nora's question," she said. "What did she ask?" "She asked me what I was going to do with it, the site, the designation." She wrapped both hands around her mug. She meant it practically. Was there going to be a museum, an educational component, a heritage program? "What was the plan? What did you say?" I said I didn't know yet. She looked at the marsh. "But I've been thinking about the word do. what we do with something, the assumption that the finding obligates us to make a product. She was quiet for a moment. Those people didn't make the clay figure so that we could make something with it. They made it so it would last, so it would exist, so something of theirs would be here after they weren't. She paused. I think the obligation is simpler than a program, she said. I think the obligation is to know, and to tell, and to keep the record. I looked at her. She was squinting slightly at the herons, one hand shielding her eyes from the morning sun. You're going to write something, I said. I'm going to write everything down. She glanced at me sideways. You've been keeping your log, I'm going to keep mine. And at some point when the process is further along and the consultations are complete, and the people whose history this actually is have had the time and space to weigh in on what it means, at that point, maybe there's a way to tell the whole story. She picked up her green notebook from the milk crate and set it in her lap. It was her fifth one. I knew because she'd told me. The first 4 were already filled. They made something to last, she said. The least I can do is make sure the record of finding it lasts too. I want to tell you how it ended, because stories are supposed to end. But this one didn't in July of that year. It was still going. The consultations were still ongoing. The soil samples were in labs in Austin and Lubbock. Mabel's hogs were still working the eastern acreage, ignorant of and uninterested in the long trail of consequence their cousins had started by rooting in the northwest corner. Nora called every Sunday now, which was new, and which Mabel mentioned with a studied casualness that did not fool me at all. What I can tell you is what I wrote in my log on the last day I'm going to include here, which was the 14th of August, a hot and white sky Tuesday morning when I drove out to Blackwater Flats with no particular reason, and found Mabel sitting on the porch in one of the old chairs with her notebook on her knee, writing. She looked up when I pulled in. "What are you doing?" I asked. "Writing down what the light looks like this morning," she said, "over the cypress trees." I looked at the cypress trees. The light was the flat, hammered white of a Texas August, throwing the Spanish moss into dark relief. "What does it look like?" I asked. "Like it's been here forever," she said, "and like it's not going anywhere." She went back to writing. I got out of the truck and sat on the other chair and got out my own notebook and wrote that down, what she said, because that's what I do. The herons moved in the far marsh. The hogs moved in the east, somewhere past the ridge, purposeful and unhurried. The cypress trees stood in the white light like things that have decided to remain. $1's worth of ground, keeping faith with something that had been forgotten for 200 years. A woman who showed up because she recognized invisible things, having been one herself. A household that was someone's whole world, returned to the record at last. I don't know what the clay figure was for. I don't know what the carved knife meant to the hand that wore it smooth. I don't know the name of the person who wore those beads, or what they were called by the people who loved them, or what they feared or hoped or carried into each morning.